Hello everyone. Welcome to World History Explored. The history of Belize dates back thousands of years. The Maya civilization spread into the area of Belize between 1500 BC to 1200 BC and flourished until about 1000 AD. Several Maya ruin sites, including Kaalpek, Caracol, Lamanai, Lubantan, Altanha, and Zunantunik, reflect the advanced civilization and much denser population of that period. One attraction of the area was the availability of logwood, which also brought British settlers. Belize was not formally termed the colony of British Honduras until 1862. It became a crown colony in 1871. Subsequently, several constitutional changes were enacted to expand representative government. Internal self-government was granted in January 1964. The official name of the territory was changed from British Honduras to Belize in June 1973, and full independence was granted on 21 September 1981. Ancient Maya civilization. Pre-Columbian Belize. The Maya civilization emerged at least 3 millennia ago in the lowland area of the Yucatan Peninsula and the highlands to the south, in what is now southeastern Mexico, Guatemala, western Honduras, and Belize. Many aspects of this culture persist in the area despite nearly 500 years of European domination. Prior to about 2500 BC, some hunting and foraging bands settled in small farming villages. They domesticated crops such as corn, beans, squash, and chili peppers. A profusion of languages and subcultures developed within the Maya core culture. Between about 2500 BC and 250 AD, the basic institutions of Maya civilization emerged. The peak of this civilization occurred during the Classic period, which began around 250 AD. Slavery in the settlement, 1794 to 1838. The earliest reference to African slaves in the British settlement appeared in a 1724 Spanish missionary's account, which stated that the British recently had been importing them from Jamaica, Bermuda, and other Central American British colonies. A century later, the total slave population numbered about 2,300. Most slaves were born in Africa, and many slaves at first maintained African ethnic identifications and cultural practices. Gradually, however, slaves assimilated, and a new synthetic Creole culture was formed. Slavery in the settlement was associated with the extraction of timber because treaties forbade the production of plantation crops. Settlers needed only 1 or 2 slaves to cut logwood, but as the trade shifted to mahogany in the last quarter of the 18th century, the settlers needed more money, land, and slaves for larger-scale operations. Other slaves worked as domestic helpers, sailors, blacksmiths, nurses, and bakers. The slaves' experience, though different from that on plantations and other colonies in the region, was nevertheless oppressive. They were frequently the objects of extreme inhumanity, as a report published in 1820 stated. In the 18th century, many slaves escaped to Yucatan, and in the early 19th century, a steady flow of runaways went to Guatemala and down the coast to Honduras. One way the settler minority maintained its control was by dividing the slaves from the growing population of free Creole people who were given limited privileges. Though some Creoles were legally free, their economic activities and voting rights were restricted. Privileges, however, led many free blacks to stress their loyalty and acculturation to British ways. The act to abolish slavery throughout the British colonies, passed in 1833, was intended to avoid drastic social changes by effecting emancipation over a 5-year transition period, by implementing a system of apprenticeship calculated to extend masters' control over the former slaves, and by compensating former slave owners for their loss of property. After 1838, the masters of the settlement continued to control the country for over a century by denying access to land and by limiting freedmen's economic freedom. Constitutional developments, 1850 to 62. In the 1850s, the power struggle between the superintendent and the planters coincided with events in international diplomacy to produce major constitutional changes. In the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850, Britain and the United States agreed to promote the construction of a canal across Central America and to refrain from colonizing any part of Central America. The British government interpreted the colonization clause as applying only to any future occupation. But the United States government claimed that Britain was obliged to evacuate the area, particularly after 1853, when President Franklin Pierce's expansionist administration stressed the Monroe Doctrine. Britain yielded on the Bay Islands and the Mosquito Coast in eastern Nicaragua. But in 1854, Britain produced a formal constitution establishing a legislative for its possession of the settlement in present-day Belize. Formal establishment of the colony, 1862-71. Largely as a result of the costly military expeditions against the Maya, the expenses of administering the new colony of British Honduras increased at a time when the economy was severely depressed. Great landowners and merchants dominated the legislative assembly, which controlled the colony's revenues and expenditures. Some of the landowners were also involved in commerce, but their interests differed from the other merchants of Belize town. The former group resisted the taxation of land and favored an increase in import duties. The latter preferred the opposite. Under the new Constitution of 1871, the Lieutenant Governor and the Legislative Council, consisting of 5 ex officio or official and 4 appointed or unofficial members, governed British Honduras. This constitutional change confirmed and completed a change in the locus and form of power in the colony's political economy that had been evolving during the preceding half-century. The change moved power from the old settler oligarchy to the boardrooms of British companies and to the Colonial Office in London. The Colonial Order, 1871-1931. The forestry industry's control of land and its influence in colonial decision-making slowed the development of agriculture and the diversification of the economy. Though British Honduras had vast areas of sparsely populated, unused land ownership was controlled by a small European monopoly, thwarting the evolution of a Creole landowning class from the former slaves. There were some exceptions, however, most notably Isaiah Emmanuel Morter, who was the son of former slaves and accumulated a large landholdings of banana and coconut plantations. Land ownership became even more consolidated during the economic depression of the mid-19th century. Major results of this depression included the decline of the old settler class, the increasing consolidation of capital, and the intensification of British land ownership. The British Honduras Company, later the Belize Estate and Produce Company, emerged as the predominant landowner, with about half of all the privately held land in the colony. The new company was the chief force in British Honduras' political economy for over a century. Creoles, who were well connected with businesses in the United States, challenged the traditional political-economic connection with Britain as trade with the United States intensified. In 1927, Creole merchants and professionals replaced the representatives of British landowners, except for the manager of the Belize Estate and Produce Company, on the Legislative Council. The participation of this Creole elite in the political process was evidence of emerging social changes that were largely concealed by economic stagnation. Genesis of modern politics, 1931-54. The Great Depression shattered the colony's economy, and unemployment increased rapidly. On top of this economic disaster, the worst hurricane in the country's recent history demolished Belize town on 10 September 1931, killing more than 1,000 people. The British relief response was tardy and inadequate. The British government seized the opportunity to impose tighter control on the colony and endowed the governor with the power to enact laws in emergency situations. The Belize Estate and Produce Company survived the Depression years because of its special connections in British Honduras and London. The labor agitation's most immediate success was the creation of relief work by a governor who saw it as a way to avoid civil disturbances. The movement's greatest achievements, however, were the labor reforms passed between 1941 and 1943. Trade unions were legalized in 1941, and a 1943 law removed breach of labor contract from the criminal code. The General Workers' Union, GWU, registered in 1943, quickly expanded into a nationwide organization and provided crucial support for the nationalist movement, Belize, that took off with the formation of the People's United Party, PUP, in 1950. The 1930s were therefore the crucible of modern Belizean politics. It was a decade during which the old phenomena of exploitative labor conditions and authoritarian colonial and industrial relations began to give way to new labor and political processes and institutions. The same period saw an expansion in voter eligibility. In 1945, only 822 voters were registered in a population of over 63,000, but by 1954, British Honduras achieved suffrage for all literate adults. The introduction of credit unions and cooperatives after 1942, following the pioneering work of Father Marion M. Gainey S.J., would gradually increase the economic and political power of the Maya and of the less affluent people in the country. In December 1949, the governor devalued the British Honduras dollar in defiance of the Legislative Council, an act that precipitated Belize's independence movement. The governor's action angered the nationalists because it reflected the limits of the legislature and revealed the extent of the colonial administration's power. Between 1950 and 1954, formed upon the dissolution of the People's Committee on 29 September 1950, consolidated its organization, established its popular base, and articulated its primary demands. By January 1950, the GWU and the People's Committee were holding joint public meetings and discussing issues such as devaluation, labor legislation, the proposed West Indies Federation, and constitutional reform. Decolonization and the border dispute with Guatemala. British Honduras faced two obstacles to independence: British reluctance until the early 1960s to allow citizens to govern themselves, and Guatemala's long-standing claim to the entire territory. Guatemala had repeatedly threatened to use force to take over British Honduras. By 1961, Britain was willing to let the colony become independent. Negotiations between Britain and Guatemala began again in 1961, but the elected representatives of British Honduras had no voice in these talks. George Price refused an invitation to make British Honduras an associated state of Guatemala, reiterating his goal of leading the colony to independence. In 1963, Guatemala broke off talks and ended diplomatic relations with Britain. Talks between Guatemala and British Honduras started and stopped abruptly during the late 1960s and early 1970s. From 1964, Britain controlled only British Honduran defense, foreign affairs, internal security, and the terms and conditions of the public service, and in 1973 the colony's name was changed to Belize in anticipation of independence. By 1975, the Belizean and British governments, frustrated at dealing with the military-dominated regimes in Guatemala, agreed on a new strategy that would take the case for self-determination to various international forums. Between 1975 and 1981, Belizean leaders stated their case for self-determination at a meeting of the heads of Commonwealth of Nations governments, the Conference of Ministers of the Non-Aligned Movement, and at meetings of the United Nations. Latin American governments initially supported Guatemala. Between 1975 and 1979, however, Belize won the support of Cuba, Mexico, Panama, and Nicaragua. Finally, in November 1980, with Guatemala completely isolated, the UN passed a resolution that demanded the independence of Belize. A last attempt was made to reach an agreement with Guatemala prior to the independence of Belize. The Belizean representatives to the talks made no concessions, and a proposal, called the Heads of Agreement, was initialed on 11 March 1981. Meanwhile, the opposition in Belize engaged in violent demonstrations against the Heads of Agreement. With the prospect of independence celebrations in the offing, the opposition's morale fell. Independence came to Belize on 21 September 1981 after the Belize Act 1981, without reaching an agreement with Guatemala. Independence. With Price at the helm, the PUP won all elections until 1984. In that election, first national election after independence, the PUP was defeated by the United Democratic Party, UDP, and UDP leader Manuel Esquivel replaced Price as prime minister. Price returned to power after elections in 1989. Guatemala's president formally recognized Belize's independence in 1992. The following year, the United Kingdom announced that it would end its military involvement in Belize. All British soldiers were withdrawn in 1994, apart from a small contingent of troops who remained to train Belizean troops. The UDP regained power in the 1993 national election, and Esquivel became prime minister for a second time. Soon afterward, Esquivel announced the suspension of a pact reached with Guatemala during Price's tenure, claiming Price had made too many concessions in order to gain Guatemalan recognition. The pact would have resolved the 130-year-old border dispute between the two countries. Border tensions continued into the early 21st century, although the two countries cooperated in other areas. The PUP won a landslide victory in the 1998 national elections, and PUP leader Said Musa was sworn in as prime minister. In the 2003 elections, the PUP maintained its majority, and Musa continued as prime minister. On 8 February 2008, Dean Barrow of the United Democratic Party, UBP, was sworn in as Belize's first black prime minister. Throughout Belize's history, Guatemala has claimed ownership of all or part of the territory. This claim is occasionally reflected in maps showing Belize as Guatemala's 23rd province. As of March 2007, the border dispute with Guatemala remains unresolved and quite contentious. At various times, the issue has required mediation by the United Kingdom, Caribbean Community Heads of Government, the Organization of American States, and the United States. In December 2008, Belize and Guatemala signed an agreement to submit the territorial differences to the International Court of Justice after referendums in both countries, which have not taken place as of March 2019. Since independence, a British garrison, British Army Training and Support Unit Belize, has been retained in Belize at the request of the Belizean government. Conservative United Democratic Party led Belize 12 years under Prime Minister Dean Barrow, until general election in November 2020 was won by the opposition center-left PUP party. The leader of the People's United Party, PUP, Johnny Bracino, a former deputy prime minister, became new prime minister of Belize on 13 November 2020. Please like this video and subscribe to World History Explored channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.